Chapter 1: The House That Would Not Finish. In the middle of modern suburban development, surrounded by traffic and palm trees, the Winchester Mystery House stands like an architectural contradiction. It is an elaborate Victorian mansion with turrets, patterned shingles, and layered rooflines that intersect at strange angles. At first glance it looks grand but conventional. The longer you look, the less sense it makes. Windows appear where no room seems possible. A staircase climbs upward and stops at a ceiling. An upper door once opened directly into open air before later safety works sealed the drop. Construction began in 1886 and continued until September 5, 1922, the day its owner died. Payroll records confirm that carpenters were employed in rotating shifts, suggesting work went on day and night for decades. What started as an 8-room farmhouse expanded into a maze that, before the 1906 earthquake, reportedly rose 7 stories. Today it stands at 4 stories and contains about 160 rooms, 47 fireplaces, more than 10,000 panes of glass, and over 2,000 doors. Some doors open into closets. Others open into walls. A few lead into corridors that circle back in disorienting ways. The owner was Sarah Winchester, widow of William Wirt Winchester of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The popular legend claims Sarah believed she was haunted by the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles and that a Boston medium warned her she must build continuously or die. There is no contemporary record of this séance. The story appears clearly in print only after her death, when the house opened to the public in 1923 and the haunting narrative became central to its appeal. Even without solid evidence for the medium story, reports of strange experiences have persisted for a century. Visitors describe footsteps in empty hallways, doors closing without visible cause, and cold drafts in sealed interior rooms. A frequently reported apparition is a thin man in work clothes, sometimes seen carrying tools or pushing a wheelbarrow before vanishing. Another is a woman dressed in black, glimpsed at the end of upper corridors or reflected in mirrors. In the grand ballroom, guests often mention sudden cold spots near the stage beneath stained glass that rarely receives direct sunlight. Some also report the smell of cigar smoke drifting through rooms long closed to smoking. Skeptics argue that the house itself encourages these perceptions. Narrow corridors, abrupt turns, and uneven floors create subtle confusion. Light filtered through stained glass shifts color and depth. Staircases with unusually shallow rises change the rhythm of movement and can produce mild imbalance. In such an environment, the mind may supply the sense of presence. Still, even critics admit that 36 years of nearly continuous construction without a master blueprint is unusual, especially on this scale. The layout often feels less like expansion and more like deliberate misdirection. Hallways intersect in looping patterns. Doors connect rooms in ways that disrupt expected flow. The so-called séance room contains multiple exits, including one leading into a closet, leading to speculation that Sarah valued unpredictability in movement. Whether these choices were meant to confuse spirits, provide privacy, or reflect evolving tastes remains uncertain. When Sarah arrived in California in the 1880s, she brought immense wealth and deep personal loss. Over the next decades she transformed a modest farmhouse in what would become San Jose into one of the most famous allegedly haunted houses in the United States. The mansion stands today as a layered artifact of grief, myth, marketing, and architectural obsession. In the chapters ahead, we will examine the documented tragedies that shaped Sarah's life, the impact of the April 18, 1906 earthquake, and the best-known sightings reported within these walls, moving carefully between confirmed history and enduring legend. Whether the Winchester House is a monument to mourning, an eccentric design experiment, or a place that invites something unseen to linger is still debated. What remains undeniable is that its corridors continue to generate stories that refuse to fade, and that enduring uncertainty is exactly why it belongs here. Welcome to StrAInge, I'm I, and today I'll be your host. Your ghost host. Chapter 2: Loss, Money, and the Move West. To understand why construction began in 1886, we have to go back to New Haven, Connecticut, where Sarah Winchester was born Sarah Lockwood Pardee in 1839. She was well educated, musically trained, and fluent in several languages, including French, Italian, and Spanish. In 1862, during the Civil War, she married William Wirt Winchester, the son of Oliver Winchester, whose company would become the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The Winchester rifle, particularly the Model 1873, became one of the most widely used repeating rifles of the American West. It was marketed aggressively and earned the nickname "the gun that won the West." It was used in westward expansion, range wars, private disputes, and violent conflicts with Native American tribes. By the 1870s, the company was a financial powerhouse. Sarah and William's only child, Annie Pardee Winchester, was born on June 15, 1866. She died just over a month later on July 25, 1866, from marasmus, a severe form of malnutrition that the doctors of the time poorly understood. The loss was devastating. There were no other children. 15 years later, on March 7, 1881, William Wirt Winchester died of tuberculosis at age 43. Sarah was 41 years old. Within 2 decades she had lost both her infant daughter and her husband. What followed was a massive transfer of wealth. Sarah inherited approximately $20 million, an extraordinary sum in the 1880s, along with nearly 50% of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Her dividends reportedly amounted to about $1,000 per day, a figure often cited in later accounts and equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars daily today. It is at this point that legend begins to overlap with documented fact. According to later retellings, sometime in 1883 or 1884 Sarah consulted a spiritualist medium in Boston. The medium allegedly told her that the Winchester fortune was stained with blood and that she was being pursued by the spirits of those killed by the rifle. The only way to survive, the story goes, was to move west and build a house continuously to confuse or appease these spirits. If construction stopped, her life would end. There is no contemporary newspaper report confirming this meeting. No diary entry from Sarah describes it. The story first appears in detailed form decades later, when the house was already being marketed as haunted. What is documented is that in 1884 Sarah left New Haven and traveled west to California. Whether that decision was driven by spiritual fear, a desire for distance from grief, or simple practicality remains uncertain. In 1884 she purchased an unfinished 8-room farmhouse in the Santa Clara Valley for about $12,000. The region was then largely agricultural, known for orchards and mild climate. The property sat on more than 160 acres of land. At the time, the area was not yet the urban center it would later become. It was rural and quiet, a place where large-scale construction would attract attention but not interference. Renovations began almost immediately. By 1886, sustained expansion was underway. Carpenters were hired locally and kept on retainer. Rather than drawing up a single architectural plan, Sarah reportedly issued daily or weekly instructions, altering rooms after they were built, adding towers, extending hallways, and commissioning specialized woodwork. The lumber was primarily redwood, chosen for its availability and resistance to termites, though it was later stained to resemble more expensive hardwoods. Some accounts from early workers describe Sarah as soft-spoken and polite but private. She often communicated through her foreman rather than directly addressing the crew. She lived on site during construction, moving between finished rooms as work continued around her. Unlike many wealthy homeowners of the era, she did not maintain a large social presence in San Jose society. Her focus appeared fixed on the house itself. By the late 1880s, the structure had already expanded well beyond its original farmhouse footprint. Turrets were added. Decorative Victorian details were installed. Rooms multiplied in ways that did not follow a conventional growth pattern. Instead of expanding outward in balanced wings, the house accumulated sections like layers of sediment, each reflecting a moment of decision rather than a long-term architectural vision. Whether Sarah believed she was evading spirits or simply reshaping her environment to contain her grief is still debated. What is not debated is the timeline. Annie's death in 1866. William's death in 1881. The move west in 1884. Major construction underway by 1886. Those dates anchor the origin story firmly in documented history, even as the reasons behind them remain open to interpretation. The next turning point would come on April 18, 1906, when the ground itself would shake and alter the mansion permanently, reshaping both its architecture and its legend. Chapter 3: The Earthquake and the Sealed Rooms. By the early 1900s, the expanding mansion in what was becoming San Jose had grown into a sprawling structure that reportedly reached 7 stories at its tallest point. Towers rose above orchards, and decorative cupolas overlooked a valley still largely agricultural. The house was no longer a farmhouse with additions. It was a full Victorian complex shaped by nearly 20 years of steady alteration. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, the San Francisco earthquake struck. Estimated today at magnitude 7.9, it ruptured along the San Andreas Fault and devastated much of San Francisco. Fires burned for days. Buildings collapsed across the Bay Area. In San Jose, the shaking was severe but less catastrophic. At the Winchester estate, however, the impact was significant. The upper 3 stories of the tallest tower collapsed. Chimneys crumbled, and sections of the exterior were torn open. Inside, staircases shifted and walls cracked. Later accounts claim Sarah Winchester was trapped in a bedroom for hours until freed by servants, though direct contemporary documentation is limited. Structural damage, however, is not disputed. After 1906, Sarah did not rebuild the fallen towers to their previous height. Instead, expansion shifted outward rather than upward. Entire sections damaged by the quake were sealed instead of restored. Some staircases were cut short. Upper-level rooms were abandoned and closed. Doors and windows that once connected to functional spaces now lead nowhere, their original context lost after structural changes. This sealing of rooms became central to the house's legend. Guides later suggested Sarah interpreted the earthquake as a warning from spirits, perhaps displeased with the pace or direction of construction. No written statement from Sarah confirms this. What is clear is that she chose not to return the mansion to its former vertical scale. In the years that followed, construction continued, but the emphasis changed. Rather than dramatic towers, the house developed complex interior pathways. Hallways overlapped. Doors connected rooms in disorienting sequences. The so-called door to nowhere, opening from an upper floor to the outside, dates to this altered period, though it may originally have led to a balcony removed after the quake. Architectural features associated with the number 13 became more visible in these later renovations. Staircases with 13 steps, windows with 13 panes, and drain covers pierced with 13 holes are frequently cited. Whether this pattern predates 1906 in meaningful form is debated, but many examples appear in early 20th century editions. By 1910, the mansion had become less a skyline landmark and more an interior maze. Sarah, now in her 70s, continued issuing detailed instructions. Workers described her as reserved but exacting, sometimes requesting changes to rooms that had just been completed. Despite the unusual layout, the house incorporated advanced features for the era, including indoor plumbing, push-button gas lighting, steam heating, and both hydraulic and electric elevators. Spiritualism remained popular in the United States during this period, especially in the decades after the Civil War. Although no verified transcript confirms Sarah conducted séances, the small interior chamber known as the séance room, with multiple exits and a single ceremonial entrance, became central to speculation about nightly rituals. When Sarah died on September 5, 1922, at age 82, construction stopped immediately. Tools were reportedly left in place. Within months, the unfinished mansion began transitioning from private residence to public curiosity. The 1906 earthquake had reshaped the building physically, but it also deepened its mystery, leaving sealed spaces and broken architectural lines that encouraged darker interpretations. The house that once grew upward into the sky now folded inward on itself, preserving the scars of disaster as part of its identity. Chapter 4: Death, Auction, and Reinvention. When Sarah Winchester died on September 5, 1922, at age 82, the nearly constant sound of construction stopped immediately. After 36 years, the house fell quiet. Sarah's will was signed on August 29, 1922, just days before her death. It was 13 pages long and reportedly contained 13 signatures, a detail frequently cited in Tor narratives. The estate was valued at several $1 million, though the exact figure fluctuates in historical reporting. She left the bulk of her personal property to her niece, Marion Daisy Merriman, and to her longtime secretary. The house itself, however, was not described in detail in the will, and it was ultimately deemed impractical as a private inheritance. The contents of the mansion were auctioned off beginning in early 1923. It reportedly took weeks to remove furniture, artwork, and personal belongings. Buyers purchased items in bulk. The structure itself, stripped of much of its interior decoration, was sold to local investors John and Mame Brown. Recognizing its unusual character, they made a swift decision to open it to the public. In February 1923, just 5 months after Sarah's death, the mansion began operating as a paid attraction. It was advertised as a house built by a haunted widow. The narrative of the Boston medium, the curse of the Winchester rifle, and nightly seances became central marketing features. Whether these elements were entirely fabricated or drawn from earlier rumors, they were now presented as defining facts. From that point forward, the house's identity shifted from private obsession to public spectacle. Guides led visitors through staircases to ceilings and doors to nowhere. The so-called séance room was framed as the spiritual heart of the mansion. Sealed rooms damaged in the 1906 earthquake became mysterious forbidden areas. The story tightened around a single explanation: Sarah built to appease the dead. The timing was ideal for such a narrative. The 1920s saw continued interest in spiritualism, and public fascination with the supernatural had not faded since the late 19th century. The house's physical strangeness supported the legend. Visitors did not need much encouragement to interpret its layout as the work of someone fleeing invisible forces. Over the following decades, the mansion's reputation grew. Newspapers and magazines referenced it as one of America's most unusual homes. By mid-century, it was widely known as the Winchester Mystery House, a name that reinforced both its architectural irregularity and its alleged haunting. The Browns and later operators maintained the core ghost narrative, blending verifiable history with dramatic interpretation. As tourism expanded in California after World War II, the house benefited from increasing automobile travel. Located in what would become the heart of Silicon Valley, in the city of San Jose, it stood as a Victorian anomaly amid rapid modernization. Surrounding orchards gave way to development, yet the mansion remained intact, preserved by its own strangeness. With public access came reports of experiences. Visitors described hearing footsteps in empty corridors, feeling cold spots in the grand ballroom, and catching glimpses of figures at the ends of hallways. Staff members reported doors opening or closing without visible cause. A recurring description involved a thin male figure in work clothes, sometimes seen in the basement or near fireplaces before disappearing. Another commonly mentioned presence was a woman dressed in black, often assumed to be Sarah herself. Skeptics argue that once the haunting narrative was formalized in 1923, suggestion did much of the work. Guests entered expecting something unusual. The architecture amplified that expectation. Narrow corridors, inconsistent sightlines, and filtered light through stained glass created an atmosphere that encouraged misinterpretation. Still, the consistency of certain reported figures over decades remains part of the case's intrigue. By the late 20th century, organized paranormal investigation groups began visiting with recording equipment, cameras, and electromagnetic field detectors. Some claimed to capture unexplained audio phenomena. None of these findings have produced definitive proof of supernatural activity, but they reinforced the mansion's reputation as one of the most famous allegedly haunted houses in the United States. What began as a private residence shaped by grief and wealth was transformed after 1922 into a carefully maintained mystery. The house's second life, as spectacle and legend, may have shaped public perception more powerfully than its first. In the next chapter, we will move from marketing and memory into the specific sightings that continue to define the Winchester House for those who walk its corridors today. Chapter 5: The Workman in the Hall. The Winchester Mystery House became one of California's most famous allegedly haunted locations. Tour scripts emphasized tragedy and restless spirits, but over time certain stories began to surface repeatedly, often from visitors who claimed no prior knowledge of the legends. The most persistent of these involves a figure described simply as the Workman. Reports of this apparition date back at least to the 1940s, when employees began sharing similar accounts. The figure is typically described as a thin man in dark clothing or overalls, sometimes wearing a straw hat. He appears near fireplaces, in the basement, or along corridors that once connected to construction zones. Several guides over the decades have claimed to see him carrying tools or pushing what looks like a small wheelbarrow. In most versions of the sighting, he does not acknowledge observers. He moves with purpose, as though continuing a task interrupted only briefly by the living. In one frequently cited account from the 1960s, a tour guide reported seeing a man kneeling beside a fireplace in the Hall of Fires, adjusting bricks. Assuming he was part of a maintenance crew, she approached to ask a question. When she rounded the corner, the figure was gone. Maintenance records later showed no workers scheduled in that area at the time. While such stories cannot be independently verified, the description of a laborer remains consistent across decades of anecdotal reports. Another recurring presence is believed by some to be Sarah Winchester herself. Visitors and staff have described seeing a woman dressed in black Victorian clothing on upper floors, especially in hallways near what is believed to have been her private bedroom. In some cases she is seen only as a reflection in mirrors, vanishing when observers turn to look directly at her. These sightings increased in frequency after the house expanded its nighttime and flashlight tours in the late 20th century, when low light conditions amplified atmosphere and suggestion. The Grand Ballroom has generated its own cluster of reports. Guests often mention sudden cold spots near the stage beneath the stained glass windows. Some have described hearing faint music, though no mechanical source was identified. In the 1970s and 1980s, paranormal investigators conducting after-hours sessions claimed to capture unexplained audio phenomena in this room, including what they interpreted as distant murmurs. Audio analysis has never produced conclusive results, but the ballroom remains one of the most frequently cited locations for unusual sensations. The séance room also anchors many ghost narratives. This small interior chamber, accessible through a single main door and containing multiple hidden exits, is said in tour tradition to have been the site of midnight consultations with spirits. Visitors have reported the feeling of being watched or experiencing pressure changes in the air. In the 1990s, one staff member described a strong scent of roses appearing suddenly in the room, lasting several minutes before fading. No floral arrangements were present at the time, and ventilation systems showed no anomalies. Similar scent-based experiences, sometimes described as cigar smoke, have been reported elsewhere in the house. One of the more unsettling elements in these stories is the consistency of certain details. The thin workman. The woman in black. The cold air near specific architectural features. While skeptics attribute this to suggestion shaped by tour narratives introduced as early as 1923, some visitors claim they encountered these phenomena before hearing any ghost story at all. Psychologists point out that the architecture itself contributes to heightened perception. The mansion's narrow corridors, uneven floors, and filtered light create subtle disorientation. Sound travels unpredictably through the structure's many chambers and hidden spaces. A footstep from another tour group may echo in unexpected directions. Temperature variations can result from differences in insulation across sealed and unsealed rooms, particularly in a building modified repeatedly between 1886 and 1922. Despite these explanations, reports have continued into the 21st century. Staff members occasionally recount doors opening against gravity, lights flickering in unused rooms, and motion sensors activating without visible cause. None of these incidents have produced documented physical evidence of a haunting, yet the accumulation of testimony sustains the mansion's reputation. Whether these accounts represent lingering energy from decades of construction, the psychological power of suggestion, or something less easily categorized remains unsettled. What is clear is that the ghost stories are no longer secondary to the house's history. They are now part of its structure, layered onto redwood beams and stained glass as surely as any architectural addition. Chapter 6: Apparitions and Echoes, Stories from the House. Within the winding corridors and labyrinthine rooms of the Winchester Mystery House, certain sightings have become so frequently reported that they now form a distinct category of Winchester lore. These accounts come from visitors, employees past and present, and local residents whose experiences resist easy dismissal even when explanations remain elusive. One of the most persistent figures described over decades is said to be a spectral presence that resembles a woman in Victorian-era clothing. According to multiple first-hand accounts, this figure sometimes appears on the mansion grounds rather than inside the house itself. Stories collected from people who once worked near the estate speak of seeing an elderly woman vacuuming, dusting, or decorating, tasks associated with daily life rather than dramatic haunting. These sightings are reported not during formal tours, but by those who have encountered the figure while performing routine work nearby. Some accounts even describe her walking through objects like cars or walls, lending a ghostly physicality to the sighting. Visitors inside the mansion also report hearing disembodied voices. These are described not as a single identifiable word or phrase, but as indistinct murmurs coming from areas such as the grand ballroom or long interior hallways. Some tour narratives emphasize these experiences as voices from employees long dead, suggesting an echo of the countless workers who passed through the house during its 36 years of continuous construction. While no structural or audio recordings have verified specific phrases, the frequency with which guests report these sounds is notable. Sightings often cluster around particular architectural features. One area frequently cited is the Grand Ballroom, where visitors sometimes experience sudden shifts in temperature or faint sensations of movement at the edges of perception. These phenomena are commonly framed in tour narratives as residual hauntings, lingering impressions of past events, though skeptics point out that variations in airflow and the house's poorly insulated construction can create natural drafts and temperature fluctuations. Another common claim involves shadowy figures observed at the ends of long corridors or reflected in mirrors. Unlike the distinct workmen described in earlier accounts, these shadows are more ambiguous, sometimes perceived only in peripheral vision or captured in photographs as indistinct silhouettes. One recent anecdote shared online involved a visitor who took several photographs in the formal dining room and later noticed a shape resembling a figure where no person had stood. While such images are prone to misinterpretation or photographic artifact, they remain part of the collective set of reports that keep public fascination alive. The so-called séance room, mentioned frequently in tour literature, is another epicenter of claimed unusual experiences. Described as a small interior chamber with multiple hidden exits and a single main entrance, the room is presented as a place where Sarah Winchester may have attempted to communicate with spirits. Visitors today report sensations of pressure changes, sudden sense, or eerie stillness that they interpret as ghostly interaction. Skeptical observers note that enclosed spaces with limited airflow often produce similar sensations in many historic buildings, especially ones with complex ventilation patterns due to frequent renovation. Local lore extends beyond the mansion's walls. Stories shared by people living or working near the property describe sightings of a woman in period dress walking across what would have been Sarah's original land before the area was heavily developed. In these accounts, the figure sometimes appears to pass through solid objects or emerge from places where no structure stands today, reinforcing the sense that some presence persists beyond architectural boundaries. Researchers and historians point out that much of the ghost story framework surrounding the Winchester house was solidified after Sarah's death, when sensational newspapers and early tourism marketing leaned heavily on themes of restless spirits and midday seances. Still, even critics acknowledge that the consistency and longevity of certain reported phenomena, voices, age-period apparitions, and recurring sensory experiences, make the Winchester house one of the most storied places for allegedly unexplained events in the United States. Whether these are the remnants of psychological suggestion shaped by legend, echoes of the countless people who passed through the mansion, or something less easily explained, the accounts themselves now occupy a place in the house's enduring mystery. Chapter 7: What Remains? More than a century after Sarah Winchester died on September 5, 1922, the Winchester Mystery House remains suspended between documented history and persistent legend. The timeline is clear. Annie Pardee Winchester died on July 25, 1866. William Wirt Winchester died on March 7, 1881. Sarah moved west in 1884. Construction began in sustained form by 1886. The 1906 earthquake reshaped the structure. Work continued until the day she died. Those dates are stable. The meaning attached to them is not. The haunting narrative, formalized when the house opened to the public in 1923, offered a clean explanation. A grieving widow, burdened by a fortune built on weapons, builds endlessly to appease the spirits of the dead. It is dramatic, morally satisfying, and easy to remember. It also rests largely on stories that appear in print only after Sarah's death, when the house's commercial survival depended on distinction. Yet stripping away the ghost story does not dissolve the mystery. 36 years of near-continuous construction without a master blueprint remains unusual. The scale of modification after the April 18, 1906 earthquake shows deliberate choice rather than simple repair. Sealed rooms were left sealed. Towers were not rebuilt. Pathways grew more complex rather than more orderly. The house did not trend toward completion. It trended toward complication. The reported sightings, whether interpreted as paranormal or psychological, have followed consistent patterns for decades. The thin workman in overalls. The woman in black on upper floors. Cold air in the grand ballroom. The scent of cigar smoke in empty corridors. Shadow figures at the ends of hallways. Disembodied murmurs in rooms built between 1886 and 1922. These experiences are anecdotal, but their repetition has given them weight within the house's living folklore. Skeptical explanations remain strong. The mansion's architecture encourages disorientation. Sound travels unpredictably through layered walls and hidden spaces. Temperature shifts occur between sealed and ventilated rooms. Expectation shapes perception, especially in a setting long branded as haunted. Suggestion, once introduced in 1923 marketing materials, may have guided decades of interpretation. Still, the persistence of the house itself complicates easy dismissal. It survived agricultural decline, urban expansion, and the rise of Silicon Valley around it in San Jose. It stands not as a ruin but as a maintained artifact. Its doors to nowhere, 13-step staircases, and interior windows remain physically present, not exaggerated illustrations but measurable architectural facts. In the end, the Winchester house may be less about spirits and more about endurance. It is a structure built through grief, wealth, and control over space. Whether Sarah constructed it to confuse ghosts, to exercise autonomy in a life marked by loss, or simply because she could, the result is the same. The house refuses symmetry. It refuses closure. It refuses a final explanation. Ghost story or not, it remains one of the most studied and visited allegedly haunted homes in the United States, a place where architecture and narrative have fused so tightly that separating them feels artificial. Visitors walk through rooms that were altered repeatedly over 3 decades and are invited to choose their own interpretation. Some leave amused. Some leave unsettled. A few leave convinced they were not alone. What survives most powerfully is uncertainty. The facts anchor the story, but they do not contain it. The house continues to generate new reports, new investigations, and new retellings layered onto redwood beams set in place more than a century ago. Whether the footsteps echoing in its corridors belong to memory, imagination, or something that resists both categories remains unresolved. And that lingering tension between record and rumor, between blueprint and belief, is exactly why the Winchester house still belongs here. This is StrAInge, and next week, we're looking at the most famous of all the mass experiences. We'll be discussing the miracle of the sun.